everyone, John here from All Miniatures Great and Small, and today we're doing another unit overview. This time one of my favorite units, the American Armored Rifle Platoon. So we're going to be looking at the Armored Rifle Platoon out of the new D-Day American book. This nice book here, a great book. If you don't have it, I recommend it if you are an American player because it is awesome. And there, in that book, there are a couple of versions of the Armored Rifle Platoon. We're going to be looking at both of those versions during this video. So what we intend to cover is the unit, what it can do, and some basic tactics. So what is an Armored Rifle Platoon? Basically, they are part of normally U.S. tank divisions. They're the infantry component, and they ride in half tracks rather than being leg infantry like normal rifle platoons that have to unfortunately walk everywhere or be trucked. So these guys, the armored refers to the armored half tracks that they ride in. It's not like they're wearing power armor or anything cool like that. Alright, so the Armored Rifle Platoon is pretty awesome, and what you're seeing here on the board is a single platoon. And it's always a little shocking the first time you see these or look at the entry and realize what it has, but it's got a lot of platoons. Now we're looking at a full strength platoon. You can also buy these at understrength size as well if you need to save on points, but I'm going to be looking at the full strength, the full size platoons from the get-go, and that's basically what I always try to do. If I'm playing armored rifles, I always try to get full platoons first, and if I just can't make it work point wise, I might take a smaller platoon or something else. Alright, so first let's talk about the two different versions of the Armored Rifle Platoon, and I've got them both here as cards. There is a veteran and a normal version of the Armored Rifle Platoon. Just to go over the differences, besides the fact that the veteran Armored Rifle Platoon is more expensive in points, the big thing is what they're hit on. So the veteran Armored Rifle Platoon is hit on a 4+, so it's hit 50% of the time, whereas the Armored Rifle Platoon, the non-veteran, is hit on a 3+, or basically hit 66.6% of the time. They both have the same save. The motivation's a little bit different. The Armored Rifle Platoon gets a confident of 4+, same as the veteran, but they do get a Blood and Guts rally bonus of 3+, which the armored, the more expensive guys, don't get. So they actually rally on a 3+, which represents the fact that they're new and they're still kind of gung-ho being in the theater, so they're not going to stay pinned down quite as much. And their skill is trained 4+, and skill is a very common thing to use for a lot of like the movement orders and so on. Over here on the veteran Armored Rifle Platoon, they're also trained 4+, but they have a special Yankee Ingenuity special rule, so a tactics of 3+. So basically, even though there's the same skill, the veterans can perform those tactical maneuvers, things like blitzes, anything that's going to use your skill as a test, tactics test. They're going to pass on a 3+ instead of a 4+. So they're going to be a little bit better blitzing, shoot and scoot, things like that. So that is the differences between the two platoons. So just keep that in mind. You'll pay significantly less for these guys, but they're hit a lot more often. And if you're trying to assault, that makes the job a lot harder. If I have a choice, I'm going to go with the veteran armored platoon. I'll play with the regular armored rifle platoon if I'm playing a particular scenario or mission or a division that these guys would better represent. Okay, so with that said, let's talk about what is actually in the platoon. All right, in the platoon you have 6 Grand Rifle teams. So these are 5 normal medium-sized bases and the command base, which is on a small stand but has the same stats as the rest of the Grand Rifle teams or rifle teams. Next we have the bazooka teams. So a full-strength armored rifle platoon has 5 bazooka teams. Next we have 2 LMG teams. That's these two over here, 2 LMG teams. So those are light machine gun teams. They also count as heavy weapons. We'll talk about those a little bit more. And then we have a mortar team, 1 60mm mortar. So all together we have 14 stands of infantry of one kind or another. Then we have 5 half tracks to drive them around in. 2 of the half tracks will have 50 cal machine guns, and the other 3 will have 30 cal machine guns. So that is the basic formation of the platoon. And as you can see, it's got a little bit of everything. It's got rifle teams to deal with enemy infantry. It's got bazooka teams to deal with tanks. It's got a mortar to go for maybe a lucky pin. And it's got light machine guns to provide covering fire and support. All right, next we're going to look at each one of these types of stands individually, particularly because we haven't looked at infantry in one of these overviews yet. If I do a rifle platoon, American rifle platoon down the road, it's going to be a little bit redundant. But since this is the first time we're looking at it, we're going to look at each one of these teams kind of individually and talk about what they can do before we put them all together. First unit we're going to look at is the M1 Garand rifle team. This is a pretty standard rifle team across most nations. It's 16-inch range, halted and moving rate of fire is 1, anti-tank 2, firepower is a 6. They are your standard rifle teams. You get 6 of them, including the platoon leader. So they can put out a decent number of shots, but rifle teams are not your bread and butter damage producers. They don't put out a lot of damage, but they cover a lot of space. And obviously in assault, if you have 6 rifle teams assaulting, you have 6 chances or swings at killing something in close combat, in assault. So that can definitely be helpful. So they aren't, again, not the best firepower producers, but they do have several other uses. Next we have the bazooka team. They have an 8-inch range, halted rate of fire and moving rate of fire is 1, anti-tank 10, 5+ firepower. You get 5 of these stands. These have 2 negative rules. One is slow firing, which means you are 1 worse hitting your opponent. So if you normally hit a German tank on a 4+, if you move, you're hitting it on a 5+. You're adding 1 to the number needed to hit. If you stay still, obviously it stays. It doesn't change. So that's the slow firing rule. And then they have an assault 5+. So the normal rifle teams and things like that, they're going to be hitting on a 4+. These guys are hitting on a 5+. So they're 1 worse in assault, because to represent the fact that it's kind of a small stand. There's only 2 guys charging in instead of 4. So those are the 2 negative things: assault 5+ and the slow firing rule. Next we have the M1919 LMG team. You get 2 of them in a full strength platoon, 16-inch range, halted rate of fire of 5, moving rate of fire of 2, anti-tank 2, firepower of 6. And they also have the negative rule of heavy weapon, which is teams cannot charge into contact, so you're not going to be charging with your LMG teams. And assault 5+, if they are in close combat, someone charges them, they only hit their targets on a 5+ instead of a 4+ like the rest of the platoon. These are your main dice producers as far as volume of fire. Each one of these can put out 5 dice if you get them in a position and they stay put. That's together that's 10 dice, which is significantly more than the 6 rifle stands can put out together. So they are great for setting up in a covering position and keeping the platoon safe or pinning a target you intend to charge. Then we have the 60mm mortar team. This has a range of 32 inches. It counts as artillery, anti-tank 1, 4+ firepower, and it also, just like the LMG teams, has the assault 5+ and the heavy weapon rule, so you cannot charge, you cannot assault with the mortar team, which makes sense. And you get one of those. The nice thing is it has a 4+ firepower. So if you're trying to pick out an enemy gun team, or maybe a Shrek or something out of an enemy platoon, that 4+ firepower will help if the enemy is dug in. Also, since it's artillery, you just need to hit once with it, and that enemy unit is pinned. So it has some uses to it. Next we have the half-track. This guy, honestly, if people are shooting at it, you might have done something wrong. You get two versions. One of them has a 50 cal machine gun, and, well, sorry, two of them in the platoon have 50 cals, and 3 of them have 30 cals. So those weapons are a little bit different. The 50 cal is going to give you greater anti-tank, greater firepower. So if you're shooting at things that are dug in, 50 cals are always your go-to weapon. They only have a front armor of 1, side and top armor of 0. They're hit on a 4+. They are reluctant. They tend to run away. But another thing to keep in mind is that these guys are your primary AA defense for your platoon. Each one of these has a self-defense. Those machine guns all have self-defense AA as a rule, so you have basically 5 AA weapons in the platoon, which is pretty nice. Granted, you don't see a lot of German air these days, but who knows, someday down the road you might, and that can help. So there you go, that is the half-track. Well, I think we've done a pretty good overview of the unit itself and its components, but knowing what each one of these types of stands can do is one thing, but utilizing this unit on the battlefield is another. This unit is really a jack-of-all-trades unit. It's got something in its toolbox for every situation. If you're facing tanks, it has bazookas. If you're facing infantry, it's got rifle teams and LMG teams. If you're assaulting a dug-in position, it has a mortar to go for that lucky pin. It needs to get somewhere fast. It can call up the half-tracks and be driven there, and so on. So you have, like I said, a lot of tools in your toolbox when you have an armored rifle platoon. Now, typically, and this discussion is more geared towards newer players. Veteran players of the game will obviously have developed their own tactics, but there are some basic things to consider. When you're an American player and you have an armored rifle company, or maybe just something being supported by armored rifles, look at what your enemy is bringing to the table. For example, if they are playing a armored company, so basically formations of armor, platoons of armor, supported by maybe some artillery and an infantry squad or two. Well, when you look at that, you now need to put a premium on your bazookas. Your bazookas are your anti-tank element. So if it's all tanks or the majority are tanks, well, a couple of these teams have just become fairly useless. The rifle teams are not that great against tanks. They can assault, so they're still important, but what's going to kill tanks more often than not are your 5 bazooka teams, so you want to keep those alive. Facing off against tanks, your LMGs and your mortar again are not going to be that helpful. You're not going to be penetrating tanks with an anti-tank rating 2 LMG or an anti-tank rating 1 mortar. So your bazookas are going to be your go-to unit. You're going to want to swap hits off your bazooka teams onto other teams, and you're going to want to keep those bazooka teams alive. You're also going to want to have a defensive formation that better represents or gives you a better chance against an armored target. And I'll bust out some tanks and show you just a simple formation. Alright, so let's say these 4 Stugs or Stoogs have rolled up on your armored rifle platoon. Well, if you're facing a armored company, you're going to want your bazookas into play sooner rather than later. You're going to want to be able to take shots at these without having your guys trapped. So here we have, and this is just very basic for the example here in the video, but basically I've got all my bazookas up front. So when they come in, they're going to take defensive fire from all of the bazookas. Now, this might seem like a logical and a good way to have this. However, you'll notice, let's say that for some odd reason the armored rifle platoon fails to hit or bail out any of these tanks. So what's going to happen now? The Stugs are going to swing and assault, and the only units they're going to be able to remove or kill are going to be bazookas. And let's say they kill, 2 out of 4 with their 4 swings. You've eliminated a big chunk of your armored rifle platoon's anti-tank in that one assault. Okay, so that's an important distinction when you're defending. You don't want, because yes, as a defender I choose which teams to remove, but I have to choose teams. If he hits successfully in assault, I have to choose a team that's in base contact with him. So rather than having your bazookas out front, you could have a more defensive line with these rifle teams. And we have the commander there in the center of the unit to provide morale. Alright, so now what happens when they assault? So they get in, miraculously they are not repelled during defensive fire. The only thing they're going to be hitting is the rifle teams. They're going to be removing the rifle teams. So let's say they killed 2 out of 4, which is statistically average. Now, assuming that the Americans are successfully able to counterattack, they're going to get all of those bazookas into play, assaulting. Now I've got 5 bazookas there. In assault, they hit on a 5+. So that means 1 out of 3 is going to hit. So I'm probably only going to get 2 successful bazooka hits out of 5 teams if I'm lucky. Okay. So even then, my bazookas, because they have that slow firing rule, they aren't the end-all be-all. They were a little bit more deadly in version 3. But this is giving you your best chance. This is giving you 5 swings basically with your bazooka teams. So we come back, and if he successfully hits, he's going to kill one of these bazooka teams. But if he successfully hits or he successfully hits, I'm going to pull the rifle team and let that bazooka continue hacking away at the German tanks. So you want to be able to create a buffer for your important part of your unit. Your bazookas are going to be the biggest threat, so that German player is going to try to pick them out as much as he can, choosing them as a target of their shooting attack, and remove them as much as possible. So keep that in mind when you're facing your enemy. Look at what they are, and the way you set up your formation is going to be in response to what you are facing. So this is that example was an attack, or sorry, someone attacking your armored rifle platoon. But let's say you wanted to attack the Stugs, which might be a more realistic scenario. Out in the open, it's not going to be very successful. If each one of these Stugs has 3 shots, that's 12 shots. You were hit on 4s, so that means 50% of their shots are going to hit. So those 12 shots are going to result in 6 hits on average, which is enough to make the assault fail and fall back. So out in the open against 4 Stugs, the odds of you getting into assault are not good. Now if there was just 3 and there were 9 machine gun shots, well then odds are in your favor. 9, in theory, they're only going to get 4.5, so they're going to fail more often than they succeed in repelling you. But what can you do? Well, nothing in this platoon can help unless you are a couple things. One is, in the rest of your army, and if you're in an armored rifle platoon, you had better have armored mortars at minimum. Everyone should have armored mortars. You'd have a line of smoke here that you're assaulting. Or you're assaulting these tanks that are in the woods or something like that. You're normally, so we're talking veterans here, you're normally hit on 4s. What you want to do is get up somehow, make it so that your enemy is hitting you on 5s, whether that's smoke, in terrain, or something. When you're hit on 5s, these 12 shots will no longer pin you on average. On 5s, you're only going to get about 3.5, 4 hits. So you want to look at those odds when you're considering assaulting. If there's 4 here and I'm out in the open, I know I'm going to get hit several times, and more than likely than not my assault's going to fail, and basically I'm just letting the Germans get free hits on my infantry. So you want to always weigh that as well, but you want to go through smoke. So let's say you have a layer of smoke through here that you're assaulting, or this is happening in the woods, so that you have that 5 up, and we'll say that, you know, they manage not to destroy any teams. So when you assault, you only move teams that are basically into base contact or can touch another friendly unit that's in base contact. So you want to make sure your front line at the end of your movement phase can cover that 4 inches, right? So when you go into assault, well, now these guys can back up. Something like that. Now there's lots of ways to do that. It's going to change in every situation, but basically you move into contact. Then Germans would take their defensive fire and we'd move on to assault. In this case, when I'm assaulting, I've given every group of bazookas at least 1 rifle team to act as a meat shield, as an extra hit point, so that if these guys come back and swing, they're going to be killing rifle teams first, then bazookas second. So there you go. Again, something to consider when facing a tank platoon or a tank heavy formation, is keep those bazookas safe. The next type of army you might face might be a infantry heavy company. So you're going to be facing a lot of infantry, maybe supported by 1 or 2 platoons of tanks, but you're mainly going to be fighting infantry. When you're doing that, you've got a couple of options. One is, if they don't have any anti-tank guns, you can safely stay in your half tracks until you get a lot closer. In fact, if you're in assault, you could move within 16 and machine gun them for a turn or 2 before they do anything. It's when they have anti-tank guns embedded that you know, you want to be out of your tracks. So German infantry, we're using an example. These are rifle MG teams, so they're got like 2 shots each. So they put out double the firepower of your rifle teams. So in a stand-up fight, these 4 stands are putting more firepower out than all 6 of my rifle teams combined. So what can I do to mitigate that? Well, one would be my LMG teams. I've got my LMG teams in the back. I've got my mortar. So my mortar might be able to pin them. Mortars are much more effective against infantry and artillery than tanks. The LMGs, both of those teams together, assuming I'm not pinned down, are going to be firing 10 shots, which is pretty nice. And basically it gives you, so let's say these guys failed to assault. So I'm moving in these Germans to assault, and the Americans get their defensive fire. How much can a typical armored rifle company put out in defensive fire? Well, just in machine guns and rifles alone, that's 16 dice worth of fire if they're not pinned down. It's 10 if they are pinned down. The rate of fire of those light machine guns significantly drops. Either way, 15 would be enough to odds on repel the assault, even if I need to hit on a 5. I guess that would be average, 50-50 chance. And then if I'm down to 10, that gives me a 50-50 chance to repel needing a 4+ to hit in defensive fire. The bazookas, though, can add a single shot if they're within 8 inches of range, so up to 5 additional shots if they are close enough to actually target some of these guys. And like the mortar is, artillery, so it's not going to be dropping. It's not going to be contributing in this goal. So when you're facing infantry, though, what you might want to do is you might want to consider pulling your hits from your bazooka teams. So let's assume the Americans are coming back, something like that. If these Germans are hitting, I might consider removing the bazooka teams. Why? Because in this scenario, these guys are hitting on 4s, the rifle teams. These guys are hitting on 5s. So these guys are more likely to inflict casualties on the Germans. The anti-tank value, all the cool stuff against tanks, is useless. It doesn't get you anything. The only thing you get swinging with these guys is the penalty, hitting on a 5 instead of a 4. So removing these guys first gives you better chance to score hits coming back. So again, depending on your enemy, you're going to look at what they have, and you're going to want to have casualties according, so that you have the most effective stands left in battle. I guess I could have saved 10 minutes there by saying, if you're fighting a tank company, kill your rifle teams first. If you're fighting an infantry company, kill your bazooka teams first. Now, in those examples, you'll notice I never really preferred to remove my heavy weapons teams here, the light machine guns and the mortar. A couple reasons for that. Even though the LMGs and mortars don't contribute that much against tanks, they can contribute a lot against infantry. One thing to consider is the morale of a unit. Remember, a platoon checks its morale if it's under 3 stands. If you've left these guys back in an overwatch position where they're not being touched or targeted, they're kind of in the back of your platoon formation, as long as they're alive, your platoon can't break. So consider them like an anchor to keep your platoon in good spirits. So that would be a one helpful reason to keep them around, as long as you'd have to keep them all within command distance of the command team. And he should always be kind of in the center of your formation, but you can see how that would help. 14 stands also means that these guys will stick around a while. It'll take a while for the Germans to whittle them down, and if you have 2 or 3 of these platoons, it can get really, really scary for your opponents. Next, just a quick discussion about the half tracks. Honestly, I tend to use the half tracks maybe 1 out of 3 or 4 games with armored rifle platoons. A lot of times I just have armored rifle platoons on the table, particularly in this version of the game, version 4, because rifle teams have gotten faster. They move 8 inches. Half tracks move 10 inches. Really, it's just a 2-inch difference. And if you're blitzing or doing some kind of movement order, you can eat that up pretty quick. So the only times I would bring on half tracks is if, one, keep in mind half tracks are very vulnerable. If I knew that I needed to cover a certain amount of distance that only the half track would get me there, or if I was facing a unit that could not threaten my half tracks, let's say a unit of German paratroopers. I might want my half tracks out so that they could pepper with their machine guns for a turn before piling everyone out and assaulting that unit. So that's another consideration why you might want to keep them on. Another thing might be you might want to call the half tracks back if you're particularly beat up. Have them hop in the tracks and get out of dodge. That's a good way to do that. Repositioning is hard, and a lot of times movement's going to be just as fast or faster with infantry, particularly since they can run over things like hedges without having to make a cross check. And these guys cross only on a 4+, so that can be dangerous. So half tracks, although cool and can provide certain bonuses, usually you don't need them. Consider carefully when you bring them on, because one of the worst things in the world is if someone blows up a half track full of 3 infantry teams and you lose all 3 guys in one shot, or some of them. It's just not a good feeling. So to avoid not feeling bad, employ those half tracks sparingly. All right, guys, the last thing I want to discuss is using these guys in the larger context above a platoon, so at the company level or at the formation level. So an armored rifle company is very powerful. It's got not only these guys as your core formation, it's got several good units that can support you, that can keep your formation, your company in good spirits. Things like the armored mortar platoon are absolute must. Armored machine guns can be good. So you've got several choices to kind of buff up your core formation with that platoon. That said, just adding an armored rifle platoon to something else, like a Sherman company, is very powerful as well, giving yourself a large infantry component that can both threaten on the offensive and hold a objective like nobody's business. So both of those are viable options. Also, you have 2 options, like I mentioned at the beginning, the kind of more veteran armored rifle platoon or company versus the bog standard one. Again, being hit on a 3+ is such a liability, particularly if you're an offensive player, you like to assault. You're going to want to go with the veteran if you can, if it works out point wise. If you're defending with armored rifles, the hit on 3 isn't quite as bad because you're not having to get through defensive fire. So if you're going to be defending, and you can dig in your armored rifle platoon and they're not going to be moving very much from that spot, well, maybe the cheaper vanilla armored rifle platoon would be a better choice. But players like me, I like assaulting, I like attacking. Even in a defensive scenario, if I see an opening, that armored rifle platoon is going to attack. And in that case, veteran rifles are the way to go. All right, guys, there you go. I probably ranted too long already on this, but I love the armored rifle platoon. It's a great unit in D-Day. It's a great unit in mid-war, in the Africa source books. Just a great unit all around. Please let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Is there any strategy or tactics that you would recommend that I missed, or did you disagree with anything that I said? I always appreciate your comments and love to read them down below. As always, please do give us a like and subscribe and click that bell so you get notified when we add new content. Also check us out on Facebook at All Miniatures Great and Small. As always, guys, thanks for watching and keep on wargaming.